October 1348. A group of English soldiers are on their knees in the mud. Their weapons are gone. Their horses are gone. Blood is drying on their faces, mixing with rain and dirt, and the only sound left is the heavy breathing of men who just lost a fight they thought they were going to win. About 20 of them, maybe 25. Not knights. Let's get that straight right away. These men were what the medieval world called men-at-arms, professional soldiers. They wore armor, they carried swords and polearms, and they fought mounted when they could afford to. But they didn't carry noble titles. They were the middle class of medieval warfare, too wealthy to be common foot soldiers, too poor to be lords. They earned their keep through violence, and up until about an hour ago, they'd been doing exactly that near the border of Picardy in northern France. The skirmish itself was nothing special. A raid on a supply line, a chance encounter with a French patrol that turned out to be twice the size they expected. Swords came out, men screamed, and when it was over, the English were surrounded, disarmed, and forced to their knees in a wet field while French cavalry circled them like wolves deciding which sheep to eat first. Now, here's the thing you need to understand about medieval warfare, and this part might surprise you. These English soldiers weren't afraid of being killed. Not really. Because in the 14th century there was a system in place, almost like an unwritten contract between fighting men across Europe. If you were a soldier of any rank, and especially if you wore armor, you were worth more alive than dead. The system was called ransom. Your captor would hold you prisoner, treat you reasonably well, and then send word to your family back home. Your wife, your brothers, your father, whoever had the money, would scrape together a sum, sometimes enormous, sometimes modest, and they'd pay for your release. It was business. Cold, transactional, and deeply embedded in the chivalric code that governed how wars were fought between England and France during this period. So when a French lord, a minor nobleman with estates in the farmland south of Amiens, rode up to inspect the captured Englishmen, nobody panicked. The lord looked them over the way a merchant looks over goods at a fair. He asked their names, he asked their ranks, he estimated their worth, and then he gave the order to bring them back to his lands. The march took the better part of 2 days, south through the flat, open country of Picardy, past villages where peasants stopped their work to stare at the foreign prisoners trudging by under guard. The English soldiers kept their heads up. They were professionals, after all. Being captured wasn't shameful. It was an occupational hazard. What mattered was how you carried yourself while you waited. And waiting is exactly what they were about to do. A lot of it. The lord's estate was not a castle in the way you might picture one. No towering stone walls or grand keeps. It was a manor, a large stone house surrounded by outbuildings, a mill, a church, and field after field after field stretching out in every direction. The land was flat and rich and dark, the kind of soil that sticks to your boots and doesn't let go. The Englishmen were not locked in cells. That wasn't how it worked for men of their standing. They were given quarters, basic, cramped, but dry, and told they could move about the grounds freely so long as they didn't attempt to leave. Armed guards watched the roads. There was nowhere to run anyway. This was deep French territory, and an English soldier on foot with no money and no horse wouldn't last a week. So they waited. They ate what they were given. They talked among themselves. They watched the sky and counted the days and wondered how long it would take their families back in England to gather the silver. And while they waited, they watched the fields. What they saw out there would change the way they understood the world, though none of them knew it yet. The first thing that caught their attention was the noise, a deep, low groaning of wood and iron being dragged through heavy earth, mixed with the grunting of animals and the sharp voices of peasants shouting commands in French. Every morning, just after dawn, the sound would start. And every morning, the English prisoners would drift toward the edge of their quarters to watch. Out in the fields, teams of oxen, 4, 6, sometimes 8 of them, yoked together in pairs, were pulling enormous wheeled plows across the land. These weren't the light scratch plows the soldiers had seen back home in parts of southern England. These were massive contraptions, heavy wooden frames mounted on wheels, fitted with iron blades that bit into the earth like the jaw of some slow, stubborn beast. And the oxen pulling them? God, they were slow. If you've never seen an ox work, picture this. Take the slowest animal you can think of. Now cut that speed in half. That's an ox pulling a loaded plow through wet clay. Every step deliberate, every movement heavy. The animals leaned into the yoke with their enormous shoulders, their heads low, their hooves sinking into the mud, and they moved forward at a pace that would make a snail feel competitive. The English soldiers thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. "Look at that," one of them said, leaning against a fence post. "I've seen wounded men crawl faster than those beasts." Another one laughed. "Back home, a single horse could do that field in half the time. What are they doing with 8 animals on one plow?" A third man, a soldier from Kent named William, or so the records suggest, supposedly said something that got repeated enough to end up in a clerk's margin notes. He said, "Those oxen move so slow, a prisoner could walk off this estate and still beat the plow to the far hedge." They made a game of it. Every morning the men would gather and place wagers, not with money, since they had none, but with portions of bread and whatever small favors prisoners could trade among themselves. They'd bet on how long it would take a team to finish a single furrow. They'd pick an ox and give it a name, usually something mocking like lightning or the wind, and cheer it on with fake enthusiasm while the peasants working the fields stared back at them, confused and a little annoyed. To these soldiers, the whole operation looked backward, primitive even. These were men who lived and fought on horseback. In their world, speed was everything. A fast horse meant you could strike first, retreat faster, outrun danger, and control the battlefield. The English had built their entire military reputation on mobility. Light cavalry, mounted raids, the ability to move quickly across enemy territory and hit before the other side could react. And here were these French peasants, yoking half a dozen massive, plodding animals to a single plow and crawling across the dirt like time meant nothing to them. "No wonder we keep beating them," one soldier reportedly joked. "Their whole country runs at the speed of an ox." The French guards didn't bother translating most of what the Englishmen said. They'd heard enough to get the general idea. A few of them smiled, 1 or 2 shook their heads, but nobody argued, nobody tried to explain. The peasants kept working, the oxen kept pulling, and the fields kept getting plowed, row after row after row, at that same maddening, unbreakable pace. What the English soldiers didn't realize, what they couldn't see from their fence posts and their jokes and their little bread wagers, was that they were watching something far more powerful than a horse charge. They were watching the engine that fed an entire civilization. They just didn't know it yet. But they would, because the harvest was coming. And when it arrived, every joke those men had made was going to rot in their mouths like fruit left too long in the sun. The oxen didn't care about speed. And in a few short weeks, the English soldiers were about to learn why that didn't matter. It started slowly, the way most important things do. One morning in late November, the first carts appeared. Big, heavy wooden carts with solid wheels, pulled by the same oxen the English soldiers had been mocking for weeks. But this time, the carts weren't empty. They were loaded with grain, wheat mostly, piled so high that the wood groaned under the weight, and the oxen leaned hard into their yokes just to get them moving. The prisoners watched from their usual spot near the fence. At first, nobody said much. A cart full of grain wasn't exactly a spectacle, but then another cart came, and another after that. By midday, a line of them stretched from the fields to the manor's storage barns, and peasants were working in teams to unload sack after sack of harvested wheat and barley. The smell of it filled the air, that dry, earthy, golden smell of fresh grain that anyone who's been near a farm knows instantly. William, the same man from Kent who'd joked about outrunning the plow, stood watching in silence for a long time. Then he turned to the soldier beside him and said something that, according to the estate records, went roughly like this: "Where is all of that coming from?" The answer was right in front of him. Those enormous fields, those deep furrows, that slow, grinding, relentless plow work they'd been laughing at since the day they arrived. All of it had been building toward this moment. The heavy plow hadn't just scratched the surface of the earth the way a lighter tool would. It had carved deep into the thick northern French clay, turning it over completely, burying weeds, exposing rich soil to air and rain. The furrows themselves, those long ridges and valleys the plow left behind, acted like a drainage system. In wet years, water ran off the ridges and collected in the valleys, keeping the crops from drowning. In dry years, moisture gathered in those same low channels and kept the roots alive. It was engineering. Brutal, simple, effective engineering. Done not by architects or scholars, but by peasants and oxen moving at 2 miles an hour through mud. And the results were staggering. The grain didn't stop coming for days. Cart after cart rolled out of the estate, not toward the manor's own stores, but toward the nearby town. The English soldiers watched as the lord's surplus was taken to market. They saw merchants arrive with coin. They saw bread being baked in quantities that would have fed a small army. They saw townspeople, hundreds of them, eating through the early winter on what this single estate had produced. One estate, a handful of fields, a team of slow, stubborn oxen, and a plow that weighed more than a man. The laughter stopped. You could feel the shift among the prisoners if you were paying attention. The joking dried up. The wagers disappeared. Men who had spent weeks making fun of the oxen now stood quietly and watched the carts roll by with something closer to confusion than amusement. A few of them asked questions, halting, awkward questions directed at guards or servants who spoke just enough English to understand. How much grain did the estate produce? How many people did it feed? How often did they plow? The answers came back in fragments, but the picture they painted was clear. This wasn't some backwater farming operation. This was a machine. A slow, grinding, patient machine that took the heaviest, wettest, most stubborn soil in northern Europe and turned it into enough food to keep an entire region alive through winter. The chronicler attached to the lord's household, probably a clerk or a priest who kept the estate's records, wrote down one particular exchange. A captured English soldier, whose name wasn't recorded, apparently told a French servant that he had thought the ox a fool's animal, fit only for meat, until he saw it fill a city's belly where no horse ever could. That one line survived, scribbled in the margin of a ledger, almost as an afterthought. But it tells you everything about what those men experienced during those weeks. They had arrived on this estate as prisoners of war, but the real prison was the one inside their own thinking, and the harvest had just broken the door wide open. Now let's pull back for a moment. Because what those English soldiers witnessed on that single estate near Amiens wasn't an isolated miracle. It was a piece of something much, much larger. A revolution that had been building across northern Europe for centuries, quietly, without fanfare, without any single person getting credit for it. And honestly, it might be the most important revolution you've never heard of. Before the heavy plow arrived, farming in most of Europe looked roughly the same as it had under the Romans. Peasants used a simple tool called an IRD, basically a pointed stick, sometimes tipped with iron, that scratched shallow lines into the soil. It worked fine in the Mediterranean. The soil there was thin, dry, sandy. You didn't need to dig deep. You just needed to break the crust and drop the seed. But Northern Europe was a completely different problem. The soil in places like Flanders, Normandy, Picardy, and the English Midlands was thick, wet, and heavy with clay. An ard couldn't cut through it. The blade would skip across the surface or get stuck in the mud. Farmers were limited to the lightest, driest patches of ground they could find, and even then, the yields were miserable. Most families barely grew enough to feed themselves, let alone produce a surplus. Then, sometime between the 6th and 10th centuries, the exact timeline is still debated by historians, the heavy-wheeled plow appeared, the carruca. It came equipped with 3 components that changed everything: a coulter, a vertical iron blade that sliced into the earth first, cutting through roots and compacted soil, a flat plowshare that cut horizontally beneath the surface, and a mold board, a curved piece of wood or iron that flipped the sliced earth over to one side, creating those deep furrows the English prisoners had watched being carved across the French fields. This thing was a monster to operate. It was heavy, it was expensive, and it demanded animal power that no single peasant family could provide on their own. A typical team required 4 to 8 oxen, and since most peasants owned only 1 or 2 animals at best, they had to combine their resources. Neighbors pooled their oxen together, hitched them to a single plow, and worked each other's land in rotation. It forced cooperation. It built communities. It created a system where survival depended on your relationship with the people around you. And here's where the ox earned its place in history. Horses were faster. Everyone knew that. A horse could plow about 50% more ground in a day than an ox could, but horses were expensive to feed. They needed oats and grain, the very crops farmers were trying to grow. They required padded collar harnesses that cost real money, and when a horse got old or injured, its meat was considered poor eating, almost worthless. An ox, on the other hand, ate grass, stubble, whatever was lying around after the harvest. Its yoke harness was simple and cheap. It was tough, patient, and almost impossible to overwork. And when it finally reached the end of its useful life, you slaughtered it and fed your family with quality beef that you could also sell at market for a fair price. The math was obvious. For a peasant trying to survive in Northern Europe, the ox wasn't a compromise. It was the only option that made sense. Pair that animal with the heavy plow and the 3-field rotation system, where one field grew wheat, another grew legumes like beans or peas to restore nitrogen to the soil, and the third lay fallow to recover. And you had an agricultural engine that could produce surplus food on a scale that nobody in early medieval Europe had ever seen before. That surplus is what built cities. Full stop. Without extra grain, there are no merchants, no craftsmen, no builders, no priests, no soldiers. Everyone stays on the farm. Everyone stays poor. But once you can feed 1,000 people from the work of 100, the other 900 are free to do something else. They move to towns, they learn trades, they build cathedrals, they form armies. Everything the medieval world became, its wars, its art, its faith, its power, grew from the dirt those oxen turned over. And yet, the men who understood this least were often the ones who benefited from it most: the soldiers, the lords, the kings. But on that estate in Picardy, a handful of prisoners were finally beginning to see the truth. By early spring of 1349, the ransoms began to arrive. Not all at once. These things never worked that way. A family back in England would receive word that their son or brother or husband was alive and being held somewhere in France. Then came the negotiations. How much, paid to whom, delivered by what method? Letters crossed the channel carried by merchants and clergy. Silver changed hands through intermediaries. It was slow, painful, and expensive, and for some families it meant selling land or livestock they couldn't afford to lose. But one by one, the English prisoners walked off that estate as free men. Some had been held for 3 months, a few closer to 5, long enough to watch an entire agricultural cycle play out in front of them, from plowing to planting to harvest to market. Long enough to see the same oxen they had ridiculed pull food from the ground in quantities that could carry a whole town through winter. William, the soldier from Kent, was among the last to leave. His family wasn't wealthy, and the ransom took longer to arrange. By the time he finally walked out through the manor gate with a French escort ready to deliver him to a port, he reportedly stopped and looked back at the fields one final time. The clerk who recorded this didn't write down what William said. Maybe he didn't say anything. Maybe there was nothing left to say. But you have to wonder what was going through his mind. This was a man trained for combat, a man who measured the world in terms of speed, strength, and the sharp edge of a blade. He had arrived on that estate full of contempt for everything he saw, the slow animals, the heavy equipment, the peasants covered in mud doing work he considered beneath him. And over the course of several months, without anyone teaching him a lesson or giving him a lecture, he had watched that contempt fall apart piece by piece. The oxen didn't care that he laughed at them. The soil didn't care about his opinions. The grain grew, regardless of what any soldier thought about the speed of the plow that broke the ground for it. And when that grain fed a city, when it kept hundreds of people alive through the coldest months of the year, it did something that no cavalry charge, no raid, no battlefield victory could ever do. It sustained life. That's the part of this story that sticks with me. Not the capture, not the jokes, not even the harvest itself. What sticks with me is the idea that these men, hard, practical, experienced men who had spent their entire adult lives in one of the most violent centuries in European history, were humbled by an ox and a plow. They had confused speed with power. They had mistaken what was visible and dramatic for what was truly important. And it took months of forced stillness, of having nothing to do but watch and think, for them to realize that the thing they had mocked was the thing that held their entire world together. Most of them returned to soldiering. That's what men like them did. The 100 Years' War between England and France would drag on for another century, and there was always work for a man with a sword and armor. But the story survived, in fragments, in margin notes, in a single sentence scribbled by a clerk who probably didn't think anyone would ever read it. And maybe that's fitting, because the agricultural revolution that fed medieval Europe never had a hero, no single name attached to it, no great battle that marked its beginning. It was carried out by millions of anonymous peasants walking behind millions of anonymous oxen across millions of acres of heavy, dark soil, and it changed the world more than any king or general ever did. So, here's what I want to leave you with. The next time you see something slow, something unglamorous, something that nobody seems to respect, take a second look. Because the things that truly keep the world running are rarely the things that get the attention. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the most important one. And sometimes the ox beats the war horse, not in a race, but in everything that actually matters. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's quietly grinding and deserves to be seen. And if you've been sleeping on the slow, steady wins, In your own life or someone else's, let today be the day you start noticing, valuing, and celebrating them.